Hello, my undead, and welcome to another JJK video. Due to the overall reading comprehension of Earth's population dropping significantly in the last few years, I figured I should start a series explaining JJK's complex power system, starting with the by far most interesting part and most effective technique, domain expansions. To first explain domain expansions, we need to describe what is being expanded. Every character in JJK has what's called an innate domain. Think of it as a sort of heart. The only one we got to see is Sukuna's, which mirrors his domain expansion, Malevolent Shrine. A domain expansion is as if you're expanding your innate domain and closing it off with a barrier from the outside world. This is because it is seen as impossible to bring forth an innate domain onto the real world. It's described as painting without a canvas or giving somebody water without the bottle. This process also imbues a curse technique into the barrier, making it a guaranteed hit, unless countered with the technique or one's own domain. This is also known as a sure hit, and is most of the time lethal in modern age sorcery. Ryomen Sukuna first showed us his domain expansion in Chapter 8, describing it as true Jujutsu sorcery. Sukuna declines to explain anything more than that, but here we can see a giant shrine appear, covered in bones. This shrine then slashes a special grade curse into 3 pieces. We also notice that there's no visible barrier for his domain. The next time we see a domain expansion is in Chapter 15, where Gojo actually bothers to explain it. He then tells us that when you are in your own domain, it's kind of like getting a stat buff in a video game, meaning the caster becomes stronger. Gojo then tells us that the most effective counter to a domain is to expand your own, as he then shows us Infinite Void, which has a barrier. This domain floods the enemy with infinite information, rendering them immobile, unless they make physical contact with Gojo, which is how Yuji and Sukuna were unaffected by Infinite Void. When expanding your own domain onto another, it results in a clash. If one domain is much more refined, has more cursed energy, or has some sort of elemental advantage, it will win over the other, and the guaranteed hit will strike. This is how Gojo overpowered Jogo's domain so easily. However, if the domains are even, they will get into a sort of tug of war in regards to which sure hit wins, shutting both of them off while the fighters battle to inflict enough damage to shatter the other's domain. This is commonly referred to as a domain clash. The first domain clash we see is with Megumi and Dagon. However, Megumi is using an incomplete domain, and he's just trying to make a hole to escape rather than have a tug of war with the sure hit. So, domains are incredible, but what are the cons? The drawbacks to using a domain are the immense amount of cursed energy it requires to even make one. And if it does not end the fight, you will be in a burnout. Burnout happens when your domain finishes, and your technique becomes nearly impossible to use. So your brain goes on a sort of cooldown to refresh the technique. The only people to ever bypass this were Sukuna and Gojo, Sukuna only being able to do it by copying Gojo. This is because he developed a reset technique in which he damages his brain on purpose to then heal it with RCT. For those who don't know, RCT is using cursed energy to heal by turning it into positive energy. This then resets the burnout, allowing him to use his technique immediately in domain again.
But Tilly, you just said it requires an immense amount of cursed energy, so how does he do this?
Well, Gojo has what's called the Six Eyes, where he can manipulate and see cursed energy at an atomic level, allowing him to use such a small amount of cursed energy you can't even quantify it. Sukuna can also spam domains because he's extremely efficient with cursed energy, has twice the amount of cursed energy as Yuta, someone who's stated to have more CE than Gojo, and Sukuna is just that guy. With 13 domain expansions in JJK, we can safely say this technique is actually rare. So how does one unlock it? Characters like Nanami have shown that unlocking a domain expansion doesn't just come with being a good sorcerer. Time and time again, it's explained that creating a domain requires hitting a precise blend of multiple factors, such as how strong the sure hit is, how fast the barrier expands, how big the barrier is, if the sure hit is lethal, how much curse energy you pour into the domain, and many more. All of these need to be a perfect blend to then expand your domain. Higuruma and Hikari are an exception to this rule because their domains come with their technique. We've only ever seen 2 sorcerers unlock their domain mid-combat, this being Mahito and Yuji. Mahito unlocks it after a near-death experience fighting Nanami and Yuji, while Yuji unlocks it after hitting a new record of Black Flashes on Sukuna, and using his domain as a last resort to be able to hit Sukuna. I would also like to add, Yuji was only able to use a domain because Sukuna used a domain in his body and because he swapped with Kusakabe, meaning he learned complicated barrier techniques. Well, Chewie, it'd be boring if all domains are the same, so how did they differ? Well, there are a few types of domain expansions, some being non-lethal, some being incomplete, and some being able to do the impossible, not closing their barrier. A lot of people interpret this as not having a barrier at all, but I believe this is not true. It's just stated to not close the barrier, because if it had no barrier, there'd be nothing to put a technique into. It just wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense. The Divine Feat is only performed by Kenjaku and Sukuna, respectively. The two had a binding vow, as theorized by Gojo, so some fans theorize one may have taught the other this open domain expansion, but there's no confirmation for that. Non-lethal domains would be like Hikari's or Higuruma's. These domains don't hurt the person in any way, but they do end up giving some sort of benefit or drawback to the two fighters in the domain. Megumi and a special grade curse are the only two characters that have an incomplete domain. As I mentioned earlier, Megumi needs the help of pre-existing structures to be able to realize his domain. Due to this, Megumi's domain has no sure hit. Well, Chewie, domains sound scary as hell, so how do we counter them if we don't have our own domain? There are a few ways to do this, such as Simple Domain, Falling Blossom Emotion, Hollow Wicker Basket, and Domain Amplification. To preface, domain amplification doesn't necessarily counter a sure hit, it just weakens whatever curse technique is about to hit you by pouring part of it into an empty domain that you wrap your body in. This is used by Jogo, Hanami, Sukuna, and Higuruma. It is theorized to be taught to the first three by Kenjaku. The next technique is first seen in chapter 35, and it's called Simple Domain. Simple Domain constructs a tiny barrier around the user, shielding them from the guaranteed hit. This technique is kind of like creating a mini clash between the Simple Domain and the Domain expansion. However, depending on the strength of the domain, the Simple Domain can be ripped away fairly quickly. Characters like Miwa and Kusakabe use this outside of a domain to automatically deflect, counter, or attack anything that enters the Simple Domain's borders. Falling Blossom Emotion is when the user wraps themselves in cursed energy and automatically counter any simple attacks coming at them, which can be used in a domain. You can still incur damage with this as shown by Gojo, but it's useful for any sure hit that's quite simple. For example, Dagon's Domain, which sends flying fish at you, can easily be countered by this technique. But for Infinite Void, Falling Blossom Emotion won't do anything. The third way is Hollow Wicker Basket, a technique from the Heian era. This is where the user interlocks their fingers like a wicker basket and nullifies the guaranteed hit for as long as the basket is up. However, like a simple domain, it can break over time. Sukuna gets around this by wrapping his second pair of hands together permanently, forming the hand sign, making it last as long as his hands are together. Thank you all for watching. Let me know what you guys want to explain next. By the way, you're not allowed to say Hikari's domain. I want to make this a series to help people understand JJK because I genuinely believe there is a serious lack of understanding in the power system. This could be because of leaks, it could be translation errors, or it could be because a lot of people like talking about things they don't know about. Anyways, that'll be all for today, my undead. Have a good night.